Did I just create the most incredible gaming experience known to man? I'm not gonna lie to you. Maybe.
I've been just madly in love with my Steam Deck lately. As with most of my arbitrary ADHD obsession rabbit holes, I've been buying up mods to tweak the hardware, playing all sorts of games on it, using this dock I reviewed on my main channel to use it as a dope desktop computer. But then I got the old familiar itch. How would this thing look on a CRT? This video is sponsored by Into the AM, the manufacturers of the shirt you saw in this video. It takes a lot to impress me when it comes to graphics tees these days, but these shirts from Into the AM are some of the best I've ever owned. They seem to fit just right, hugging you without being too uncomfortable or revealing. They're super soft, they feel pretty durable, and they don't shrink in the dryer. Plus, it helps that so many of the designs are just my vibe, too. If you want to feel as good as you look and look pretty darn good, head to my link in the description and save 10% off your order. Now back to some analog goodness. This idea kind of crashed right into the Steam Demo Fest this summer, and more recently the indie game trailers being showcased outside of Gamescom. There's a massive wave of indie games creating fun experiences with retro-style graphics being the focus. Whether we're talking Nintendo 64-style collectathons or PlayStation 1-style horror games, these indie devs are low-key carrying the gaming industry on their back by still delivering complete, self-contained experiences that let you just have fun with gaming instead of forcing us to swallow shallow, incomplete, over-monetized garbage. So while yes, with Emudeck set up, I could just play classic games on a CRT for my Steam Deck, chunky pixels from the Super Nintendo, clunky 3D from the PS1, and crazy action gameplay from the PS2 can all be enjoyed nearly perfectly on the Steam Deck. But where's the fun in that? I already have original consoles. I want to see how more modern games, and especially these indie games trying to recreate the classic vibe and feel that we remember, look on classic analog tubes. I'm Addy, and welcome back to Lost Saves, and I recommend watching this one full screen to really get a feel for the textures at play here. Kick back, enjoy some classic gaming vibes, and I'll also discuss the means by which to get the Steam Deck working on analog displays as we go. By far, the simplest solution for my particular den of analog horrors was to hook the Steam Deck up to my BVM. This is the Sony BVM D24, a 24-inch widescreen HD-compatible broadcast video monitor. It syncs signals at 240p, 480i, 480p, 720p, and 1080i. Covering both classic NTSC video ranges and more modern HD-era broadcasts, all while still being processed completely in analog. No added input latency or funky scaling, like this awful HD CRT, for example. By supporting 720p right out of the box, it's perfect for something like the Steam Deck with a native targeting resolution quite close to 720p. I did run into a couple of snags, though. First, since I was planning on just setting a native 720p output and didn't need any scaling involved, I intended on using one of these, a Porta HDMI to component converter. I've used converters that go both ways from this brand for years, as they're cheap, easy to adapt to USB power just needing 5 volts, and don't do any processing, and thus are lag-free. But for some reason, my BVM just wouldn't sync to it from the Steam Deck. I've used it with the BVM before. I don't understand. 720p was a garbled mess, 640 by 480 wasn't quite right either. The only one I could get working was 720 by 480 60, which, while that worked totally fine and expected, it still just didn't seem quite right. I futzed with the input plugs, making sure I had my 75 ohm resistors on the output ports. Nothing quite worked. So instead I passed the HDMI through this HD Fury X4. A much more expensive device, one I historically used to be able to play my Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 1080p for capture, while scaling to 720p or 1080i for play on the BVM. This let me pass through 720p native just fine. Everything worked with the UI and functioned perfectly as expected. Something I couldn't take for granted, and you'll see why soon. Games looked great here too. 720p is crisp and sharp on this BVM, with Pseudoregalia, a N64-style 3D platformer, playing absolutely brilliantly on here. Keep the lights dim and enjoy some modern retro gaming. You get a nice glow with the high-contrast character design, but the UI is clearly conveyed and you can do everything you need to. Retro widescreen gaming is always a treat. Cherophobia has a sorta realistic pixelated art style that looks super sweet on an analog display like this, though I think my controls weren't working correctly. Knight's Try puts you in a suit of armor in a very Super Mario 64 looking world and challenges you to solve riddles and puzzles. though I'm apparently stupid and gave up pretty quick. The art style is lovely though. Boltgun is a boomer shooter in the Warhammer 40k universe, designed to look like an old build engine game, and by far shines the best on the BVM. Designed for widescreen, it utilizes this 16:9 CRT quite well, with the old PC-like graphics playing quite well with the 1000 total vertical lines, or TVL, of my D24. This line count is actually a detriment for conveying the rest of these games. I love this BVM. It's been good to me, and I've had many offers from potential buyers, but I'm not done with it just yet. Soon though, maybe, soon. Check out my videos on this thing, linked below. But one of the things I always find frustrating about it is just how clear and crisp it is. The TVL count refers to the number of vertically, left to right, scanned video lines produced by the ray gun at the back of the tube. This one scans 1,000 lines of video at a time, which is a lot. This is great for having crisp, high-detail 1080i or 720p HD video for color grading and accuracy checking and so on, but not great when you're trying to emulate the look of video games, only sending 720 by 240 or 720 by 480 pixels at a time in the first place. On top of the perfection of the image, you lose a lot of the analog charm that you probably imagine when thinking of playing on an old TV as a kid. We weren't playing on 10 grand professional monitors as kids, or at least I wasn't. I was gaming on the cheapest TVs we could fit into the room for the size. If nothing else, the native widescreen aspect isn't what I was after anyway. Sure, the BVM could display 4:3 too, but I wanted a real 4:3 display. My next stop was a PC CRT monitor. These can be had super cheap or free just about anywhere these days if you spend a few weeks hunting on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, OfferUp, and so on. I have a video on PC CRTs and how to get them linked below, and PC CRTs can be a wonderful alternative. With the right scaler, any old video game console can display crisp, chunky scan lines on here, and PC gaming is a blast too. I've got a video on modern PC gaming on a CRT linked below as well. Thankfully, plugging the Steam Deck into a PC CRT monitor is as easy as it gets. I've collected a handful of these USB-C to VGA dongles over the years to use with the NVIDIA RTX 20 series GPUs and newer AMD RX 7000 GPUs that came with the USB-C outputs on them, and they work pretty fantastically right out of the box. Even here on the Steam Deck, plug it right into the top of the deck, connect a VGA cable to the monitor, and off to the races. Steam Gaming Mode lets me set the resolution to a number of 4:3 formats right here, including 640 by 480 p60, 800 by 600 p60, and 1024 by 768 p60. I went with 1024 by 768, low enough to still get some good separation in the pixels, but high enough to get some usable UI out of Steam. Unfortunately, Gaming Mode will not let you output interlaced video this way, nor does it seem to support higher refresh rates with this dongle, which is unfortunate, as PC CRT monitors absolutely look their best with a minimum of 70 Hz, with this specific silicon graphics monitor even supporting 120 Hz in 1024 by 768 quite easily. You can mess around with XR&R in the desktop mode and add custom display options, but those cannot be put in the gaming mode menus, and I did not feel like messing with it. Another drawback is you obviously don't get any sound this way. Steam Deck pushes audio through the USB-C external display, and VGA does not carry audio, nor does my CRT have speakers. So I'm playing without sound here. Regardless, this looks freaking incredible. I love this silicon graphics tube, and both modern and retro games look incredible on it. Aside from a couple that don't support the 4:3 aspect ratio, everything looks really nice. Frogun is another N64-inspired game where you use the titular Frogun to grab items, shoot them, grapple hook your way across the level, and collect coins. The Mega Man X collection does not support 4:3 output, but it does support a stretched video mode. So 4:3 stretched to 16:9 stretched back to 4:3 is basically the same thing, right? Lost Castle is a cartoony, kinda retro roguelike that looks like a Flash game I would have played on my PC CRT monitors back in the day. Brawlhalla kinda looks in a similar vein here too. Just add the Newgrounds logo and it fits perfectly. Beat Hazard is a music-based shmup that I used to play a decade ago or more, and I recently picked up the sequel, and holy balls, does the glowing, crazy effects of this game render absolutely beautifully on a CRT. It was at this point I started to run into some annoyances. First, the minor inconvenience that this dongle can't charge my deck while I play. Not a big deal, these indie games don't tax the deck too hard, and I can only play for small intervals at a time anyway. Plus, there are USB-C docks with VGA, so that could be a non-issue. But most importantly, I kept running into an issue where when set to 4x3, the Steam gaming mode overlays wouldn't work. The normal Steam button menu, the settings menu, neither would show up. Even weirder, it was inconsistent. On multiple days when I first set things up, the menus would work fine for a moment, necessary for games that don't have a native quit option or just didn't work right with controls at all, but it would eventually stop working. Even with replugging the USB connection, which I had to do repeatedly to exit uncooperative games, the menus would not come back. And they always worked over top of the Steam normal UI, but not over top of games. I'm not really sure what to blame this on. I'm not sure if this is a 4x3 specific issue or some sort of weird update, as I've seen other reports of controller issues in docked mode recently, and I've experienced some of them myself, but it definitely made this a less seamless experience than I was hoping for. Nevertheless, I persisted towards the dream of the ultimate analog, how I remember it gaming experience. I grabbed a cheap HDMI to composite converter, set the Steam Deck to output 640x480, and plugged it up to my big boy 37-inch Toshiba 4x3 CRT. This thing is massive, has component input, and is all analog, but still only supports 240p and 480i. No lag, beautiful image with some degradation along the edges, pretty solid sound too. Now this was an experience. This was the way retro-inspired games want to be seen and felt. Admittedly, due to the cheap converter, there's extra janky interlacing, flicker, and dot crawl, more so than present than should be, but we'll address that in a few. First, I had to game. Celeste is a beautiful 2D platformer with a lovely visual style, and oh my goodness, does it carry perfectly on this chunky analog TV. I haven't made it too far on the Steam Deck, seeing as I own it both on PS4 and Switch on top of the Steam copy, but hey, it's one of the perfect games for this example. Aero GPX is a 3D anti-gravity combat racing game, basically Wipeout with a more classic simplistic art style. It's like what a SNES version of Wipeout would look like if rendered in 3D, and hot damn, does the scanline separation really do it justice here. This big Toshiba TV has a slot mask instead of the aperture grill style front that you see people typically drooling over the Sony Trinitrons for, with thick juicy scanlines, but I actually think I prefer the slot mask design that you see here. It just feels more like home, like my childhood memories. And having such a big TV means I can just sit back and relax. Corn Kids 64 is another N64 inspired 3D adventure where you play as a mutant goat with corn powers. It's a bit goofy, and I'm still finishing up the tutorial space, but it plays incredibly well on a CRT, reminding me exactly of how classic N64 games felt. Similarly, of course, we have Yooka-Laylee. Developed by Playtronic, a studio filled with some ex-Rare staff, this Banjo-Kazooie spiritual successor seems to have really launched the modern retro game genre revival, and I'm proud to have been an original Kickstarter backer back in the day. While it looks wonderful on modern systems and even the Switch, it also looks pretty fantastic on a CRT. Mortal Sin is a fantastic first-person action roguelike with a very interesting, retro, noisy visual style. I dig the overall style, but I think it actually trends a little too dark and noisy to look great on a CRT. Coromon is a lovely Pokemon Light that I've been playing on my Steam Deck off and on for about a year now, usually when I'm dropping my kiddo off at school or something. It's a lot of fun and has a pretty solid soundtrack, but it misses that certain charm of Pokemon, I guess, having grown up with it. I don't know. Regardless, it has great pixel art and looks pretty decent on a CRT, though it didn't want to adapt to 4x3 for some reason, so technically this is stretched. Gauntlet, the one from 2014, was honestly a pretty sad release in one of my top favorite game franchises. Owning the 4-player Gauntlet arcade cab is high on my bucket list, and Gauntlet Dark Legacy is one of my favorite PS2 games ever. This one tries to be a bit too modern and comes out shallow, but it plays nicely on a CRT, other than the UI being a little too small for such a low-res setup. Post Void is a super trippy, psychedelic first-person roguelike that pushes you to move and kill your enemies as quickly and humanly as possible. I think this looks and plays beautifully on a CRT. Ion Fury is a modern build engine game, not emulating it like Boltgun, but literally built within a modernized version of the build engine and released by 3D Realms. I streamed it a bunch a few years ago playing on a PC CRT. The art style looks pretty decent on a consumer CRT here, but I I think it would also probably be best played on a PC CRT monitor or on a widescreen solution like the BVM. Also with a keyboard and mouse. For a more modern game, Streets of Rage 4 actually looks brilliant on here. It feels like I'm playing an updated arcade version or something. Again, I kept running into issues where the Steam overlays would not work anymore. And what's weirder here is that they would pop up, as in I could hear the sound and interact with their functions, but they wouldn't render visually for me to see what I was doing at all. It's really frustrating. One final stop. Both because I wanted to play more games from this massive list I splurged on, and because I wanted to test the highest end way of scaling this footage, the RetroTINK 4K. Yes, with some custom trickery, the top-end video upscaler can also be used to downscale my footage. Now, I was hoping to use this 1991 Sony PVM 1431, a tube with a lower 450 line count, but would look pretty great with these games. But it's RGB only, instead of also supporting component. And I don't deal with RGB, so I don't have any real means of losslessly converting HDMI to RGB without, messing with the signal, and piping S-Video into it for 480i just wasn't looking too hot. So instead we swapped to this little guy, the Sony PVM 8042Q, a tiny 8-inch 250 TVL PVM with composite, S-Video, RGB, and component input. Load up the 240p mode line on the RetroTINK that I modded in, fix the scaling issues, and whew, it's glorious. Truly glorious. Dark Void Zero, an old Metroidvania that inspired the Dark Void game you probably know, crispy pixels. A Hat in Time, a 3D platforming adventure comparable to newer Crash Bandicoot and Mario titles, feels like it was just made for this kind of setup. But of course, I could not try running Diablo on here too. The UI is utterly obliterated through the signal decimation, low resolution, and tiny screen, but the gameplay honestly looks pretty great. Same with Skyrim. It feels like it looks on any other modern display. The crunchy textures work perfectly here. I might be in love with this Tower of Power. I also flipped back to my 37-inch big boy CRT with this RetroTINK setup to play a few other games, including Lunistice, a Sonic-style game that feels really well made, but I am trash at, just like with Sonic. And it's breathtaking. So, is the Steam Deck the ultimate retro gaming system? Not exactly, but it could be close. We definitely need a fix for the menus not working in 4x3, and I'd love to see better integration for adding custom formats to the gaming mode external output. But I had a lot of fun doing this. More importantly, I learned about a ton of new modern retro games to play on my CRTs here. Seriously, some of these were demos, but I accidentally spent like $500 for this video. So, go support these games and consider becoming a channel member or something, or buying my ambient music album, Desolate, linked below. That wasn't, mistakes were made. Of course there's a car alarm going off right now. I have more CRT experiments coming, including a very cool demo with this BVM before I consider selling it, so get subscribed. I truly hope you enjoyed this video. I had a blast making it, as I did with every video on this channel. On top of, all the money spent here, I captured nearly 1 terabyte of footage for this video. I wanted to make sure you enjoyed the analog glory as clearly as possible. And I'd say it paid off. Watch this video to learn why I'm never giving up my old cathode ray tubes, and remember to be kind, rewind. Boom shakalaka.